The Barbarian. Chapter 1. Part 2. He continued his advance deeper into the forest. The last vestiges of daylight faded rapidly behind him. The world around him transformed as the sun dipped completely below the horizon, plunging the woods into a profound darkness. Shadows stretched and merged, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous forms. The chirping birds have long since fallen silent, replaced by the nocturnal symphony of rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the unsettling calls of unseen creatures. Each step he took sent faint echoes through the hushed trees, and the rhythmic drag of Kenny's body behind him was a constant morbid companion in the encroaching night. The air grew colder, and with it carried the damp scent of dew and decaying leaves. The barbarian asked Kenny where they were, not yet ready to admit he was lost, but the dead goblin offered no reply, his lifeless eyes staring into the oppressive darkness. The forest floor remained his silent tomb, and his silence was absolute. He continued to drag his limp form. The scraping sound was a stark contrast to the night's quiet. The trees loomed like skeletal giants. Their branches clawed at the starless sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of unseen movement in the undergrowth sent the barbarian on edge. He was deep within the shadowed woods, utterly alone save for his grim, silent companion. The barbarian gave himself a task and searched for dry leaves and twigs. His fingers fumbled in the oppressive darkness. Even when he found what seemed like good kindling, his attempt to create a flame proved futile. The damp air conspired against him, and the hand-drill kit he had made. The tinder refused to catch. Despite the barbarian's best efforts, any hope of progress was quickly swallowed by the gloom and left him with nothing but cold, damp wood and utter frustration. The forest remained a vast, inky black, and it offered no warmth or light. The barbarian tried again. He grit his teeth against the chill, but the dampness of the kindling and the encroaching cold proved too formidable. His fingers grew numb and struggled to hold the hand drill steady, and the precious embers scattered uselessly into the vast, consuming darkness. No matter how many times he tried, the wood remained stubbornly unresponsive and refused to ignite into a comfortable flame. The forest was a tomb of black and gray, and the sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, and now there were distant, eerie cries. They pressed in closer and magnified his isolation. Kenny lay a few feet away, a darker silhouette in the almost total lack of light. He offered no warmth or solace. Just as he began to drift into an uneasy slumber beside Kenny, the air was split by harsh, chittering snarls. Two more goblins lunged from the darkness. Their eyes gleamed with malevolent intent in the gloom. Their crude scimitars glistened in the twilight. With a primal roar, the barbarian seized the lifeless form of Kenny and swung him like a monstrous flail at the goblin that charged him. The stale stench of death filled the air as Kenny connected with brutal force. The impact made a sickening crunch that echoed through the trees. The savage strike proved to be a critical hit, and the goblin crumpled in a seizure. Its small body was unable to withstand the onslaught as it fell in convulsive spasms. The barbarian turned his attention to the second goblin as he swung the corpse of Kenny like a medieval flail. "Come here!" the barbarian bellowed. The remaining goblin faltered for a moment, stunned by the ferocity of the attack, then horrified by the barbarian's command. Pressing the advantage, the barbarian swung Kenny once more, the goblin corpse a brutal, makeshift weapon. The second blow landed with a wet thud as Kenny's head made contact with the goblin's. The goblin collapsed beside its companion, defeated. the forest fell quiet once more, but this time it was the silence of a hard-won victory. The barbarian stood victorious, the immediate threat vanquished, though the night remained cold and the journey ahead uncertain. He knelt amidst the tangled undergrowth. The gamey scent of goblin mingled with the coppery tang of fresh blood. The two new goblin corpses were as meagerly equipped as the first. From their tattered tunics and rough pouches, he retrieved a combined total of 12 copper coins and the 2 crude scimitars they wielded. A wild grin appeared on the barbarian's face. He turned his grim attention to the fallen goblins. He hauled the 2 fresh corpses closer together, their lifeless forms a grotesque tableau. With a final, macabre arrangement, he positioned them in a rather unconventional, unsettling manner. He had ensured one was on its back, the other on top, belly down. With their shapes contorted against the dark forest floor, one might recognize this as a 69 position. The night remained silent, save for the distant haunting calls of nocturnal creatures and the barbarian's rumbling chuckle. The chilling scene he had created added a dark, disturbing feeling to his presence. Amidst the deepening gloom, he looked closer at his work and noticed one of the goblin's little green testicles had not fully submerged in the other's mouth. In fact, it hung awkwardly down the side of its face. Upon seeing this, the chuckle turned into a guttural laugh. This echoed through the silent night that seemed to mock the darkness and the stillness of the forest. With tears flowing down the barbarian's cheeks, he thought this was the funniest thing he had ever seen. The barbarian looked at Kenny and inquired if he thought this was funny. Yet, he remained as stoic and unresponsive as ever. His lifeless eyes stared into the impenetrable darkness. To the grotesque arrangement, he showed no sign of amusement or even acknowledgement. The only answer was the rustling of leaves and the distant lonely cry of a nightbird. The forest held its breath. The silence amplified the unsettling nature of the barbarian's solitary conversation with the dead. With one final resounding chuckle, the barbarian reached down, and his hand brushed against the cold, clammy skin of the goblin he had named Kenny. His body was stiff and unyielding. The first signs of rigor mortis were clearly showing. He noticed the noose had loosened in his travels, or perhaps it was the fact that he had used him as a flail to stop his attackers. The barbarian wondered if Kenny had known the other two, but the thought was dismissed as quickly as it had come. He gripped the noose with both hands and pulled it tight. However, there was a small pop that emanated from Kenny's neck. The barbarian realized he had pulled the noose too tight and swiftly apologized. Upon further examination of his new friend, the barbarian gave a grunt of satisfaction. He looked around and saw the darkness had deepened during his time of personal amusement. He grabbed the vine noose once more. The rough fibers dug into his palm, and he resumed his trek through the inky darkness of the forest. Kenny's body slid against the uneven ground, a constant chilling rhythm that accompanied the barbarian's heavy footsteps. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and the deeper he ventured, the more oppressive the darkness became. The sounds of the night, once distant, now seemed closer, surrounding him with whispers and unseen movements. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined above, which completely obscured any view of the stars. He was a solitary figure, as he dragged his dead companion further into the heart of the shadowed woods. The barbarian murmured his thanks to Kenny and admitted that he was his best friend, a strange, private acknowledgement amidst the vast indifference of the night. He, of course, said nothing, his lifeless form trailing behind him like a heavy, silent shadow. Total darkness had pressed in as the forest continued its hushed vigil, broken only by the faint sounds of his passage and the unsettling drag of the goblin's body. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the cold bite of the night deepened with every step he took further into the unknown woods. The barbarian was lost, and he knew it too. He pushed the thought out of his head and inquired about Kenny's well-being, but he offered no reply. His sightless eyes were fixed forward, unseeing, and the slackness of his limbs spoke only of death. He remained a silent, cold weight as he was dragged through the oppressive darkness of the forest. The barbarian halted his trek through the forest and raised an eyebrow as if he had come to some sort of epiphany. He hefted his great axe. Its familiar weight was a small comfort in the oppressive dark. With a dark determination, he began to carve into Kenny's stiff back. The blade bit into flesh and sinew, and under the barbarian's skillful, though rough hand, a crude map began to take shape. He etched the location of the snare trap where he awoke, the small clearing where he fought the goblins, and the path he had taken since. It's a stark, brutal record of his journey, etched onto a dead foe. The silence of the forest was his only witness to the grim cartography. He paused and admired his handiwork, a morbid, yet functional, record of his struggles. The darkness remained, and the journey continued. After what felt like an eternity, a faint, flickering glow became visible through the dense canopy. A distant yellow spark in the overwhelming dark, accompanied by the subtle, rhythmic sound of rushing water. The barbarian paused. His senses worked overtime in the deep night. The ground beneath his feet was soft and uneven, a thick carpet of fallen leaves and damp moss that muffled his steps. The air was cool and carried the sharp scent of pine needles and wet earth. Ahead, the flickering light remained a weak beacon, a small, wavering flame that barely cut through the dense blackness. The sound of rushing water was clearer now, a constant soothing murmur that suggested a stream or a small river not far off. The massive trees around him were ancient and imposing. Their branches wove a suffocating canopy overhead, which completely obscured any hint of stars or moon. The barbarian approached the flickering light, which was slightly more discernible. It appeared to emanate from a small clearing ahead, just beyond a dense thicket. As he got closer, the barbarian realized the light was not from a single campfire, but from a collection of crudely made torches stuck into the ground. Around the light, he saw rough shapes of what could be tents and what appeared to be a rough-hewn wooden structure. He moved cautiously towards the flickering torchlight as he pulled Kenny behind him. The rustle of the leaves beneath his feet seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise quiet night. As he crept closer, the crude camp came into clearer view. 3 small, animal-hide tents were pitched haphazardly around a sputtering fire pit. The flames were barely visible. The wooden structure he saw earlier was a makeshift watchtower, though it looked currently unmanned. The air here was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale cooking fat, and something else, a rank, gamey odor that he recognized from the ambush site. The barbarian listened and heard low, guttural voices. They spoke in a harsh, chittering tongue, and it came from within the tents. Upon the dawning realization that he had stumbled into a camp of goblins, the barbarian lost his cool. He shouted out of fear as he swung Kenny's noose in a downward swing as hard as he could. He obliterated one of the tents, which had a number of the chittering goblins in it. He swung Kenny again, using him as a weapon as he had before, repeatedly up and then down again on the tent. The goblins inside were beaten to death by foe they did not see nor hear. Kenny's corpse was as dense as stone, which was attributed to the cold environment and the rigor mortis that had seized it. The remaining inhabitants of the camp erupted in fury. Several more goblins spilled from their shelters in the watchtower. They brandished crude weapons and bared sharp teeth. Upon seeing this, the barbarian let Kenny's noose slip from his grip to the damp forest floor. It landed with a wet thud as the barbarian readied his battle axe. He swung at the nearest goblin, and it shrieked like a child when the axe bit deep into its side, with flesh and blood spraying into a red mist as it settled onto the cold forest floor. The goblin took a single step back, staring at the barbarian with a look of shock. Then he looked down at the havoc the barbarian had wrought upon him and brought his hands to his belly in a futile attempt to keep the entrails from spilling out of his body. The goblin then fell and died before he hit the ground. The remaining goblins recoiled. Their eyes were wide with fear. Several seconds had passed as the goblins slowly encircled the barbarian while they attempted to steal their composure. He counted 4 of the small green creatures and briefly wondered how many were in the tent he destroyed. He wanted to know how many goblins he had killed tonight. He made a mental note to count them all. He swung in a circle, holding his axe with one hand, and extended his arm to maximize his reach. The result was devastating to the goblins that had encircled him. The level of the swing was at neck height for a goblin. 3 of the 4 were instantly decapitated. Their bodies collapsed with geysers of blood where their heads had been, those of which now rolled on the ground and slowly came to a stop. The one goblin that did not suffer the same fate had brought its arms up to its face in an instinctual reaction of fear. It flinched. Instead of its head rolling like its companions, it was the goblin's hands. The barbarian looked at the handless goblin and cringed. The goblin's natural reaction to such a debilitating injury disgusted the barbarian to his core, similar to how one would see a dead, rotten rat. It was not the barbarian's actions that spurred this reaction on himself, but the goblin itself. The goblin was sobbing, not from the pain, but upon the dawning realization that he had no hands. Taken from a single swing of an axe, the goblin dropped to its knees and started talking in its chittered tongue. It brought its new stumps together with tears streaming from its black, beady eyes, as if it were pleading or begging. The barbarian did not know what it was saying, but he knew it wanted mercy. The barbarian looked at the goblin in its utterly hopeless state and realized the goblin had really thought there was a chance he would let it go. The barbarian stifled a laugh and picked up one of the goblin's severed hands. It was cold and clammy with skinny, bony fingers with long black fingernails. The barbarian slapped the goblin with the back of its own hand. The goblin's reaction was priceless to the barbarian. The slap with its own hand had shattered the vestige of hope in an instant to a sudden realization of imminent death. The barbarian began to laugh. This petrified the goblin, and it was frozen in a fight-or-flight scenario. Just when the goblin thought it had made a decision, it was struck with its own hand again. The goblin looked up and saw the barbarian laughing again. He was pinching its hand by the middle finger, dangling it precariously in front of the goblin's face, actively mocking it. The barbarian discarded the hand to the forest floor, tossing it as if it were trash he no longer wanted. The goblin watched with forlorn attention as the barbarian started speaking and pointed at its fallen comrades and counted with his fingers in an exaggerated fashion in order to ensure the goblin knew it had no hands. The goblin did not know what the barbarian was saying, but it knew he was counting its dead friends, and it was being made fun of. The goblin snapped and raised its stubs to attack the barbarian. However, he knew what the goblin was about to do before it even tried. Before its pathetic attempt of an attack, he grabbed the goblin by the back of the neck with one hand and its left arm with his other, and dragged it to the fire. The goblin kicked and screamed, but it was no match for the barbarian's strength. The goblin thought it was to be thrown onto the fire pit, to burn alive, and for a brief moment, it recalled gathering the fuel to start the fire not even 2 hours ago. Just when it thought its time had come to an end, the barbarian plunged its bleeding left stub into the burning coals. The goblin howled and yawed. It noticed the coals were burning the barbarian's hand as well, albeit he was not touching them. The radiant heat was still hot enough to blister his skin. Nevertheless, the barbarian showed no signs of pain, or even discomfort, only a grim smile and a determined focus to the task. This terrified the goblin, and it had caused a complete loss of its bladder control, pissing all over itself, not from the pain, but from total fear of the barbarian himself. The goblin knew now. It would be a long night. Once the barbarian was satisfied with his primal method of cauterization, he immediately forced the goblin's right stub into the fire and repeated the process. Again, the goblin screamed a guttural sound, and this time it tore its vocal cords. The goblin found that it had completely lost its voice and wondered if it was permanent. For a brief moment, this distracted the goblin from the searing pain of his sizzling stub on the coals. It looked at the barbarian and saw he realized the goblin had tore its voice, and he started laughing as he pressed the goblin's stub further into the coals. The goblin screamed again, but the sound was a low, raspy squeal, which caused the barbarian to laugh even harder. After a few agonizingly long seconds in the fire, the barbarian had stopped the goblin's blood loss. The goblin's stubs were charcoal black and brittle. The slightest touch could break the sear, and blood would flow again. However, the macabre work had succeeded in its purpose. The goblin fell on its back, numb from shock, and looked at the barbarian, horrified as to what he would do next. The barbarian began to speak for several minutes, gesturing to the ruined camp and its dead inhabitants. The goblin did not understand, but it made out 2 words of the barbarian's tongue that sent a wave of terrible comprehension through its mind. My and slave. The barbarian finished speaking and saw the goblin understood. He walked among the ruined camp and found some rope. Then, he led the handless goblin to a nearby tree and began to tie him there. The goblin, both in mind and body, was utterly defeated. It offered no resistance as the barbarian finished the knot and turned his gaze to the goblin's former abode. He carefully moved through the wrecked camp, his great axe held ready. The initial tent he struck was a shredded mess of hide and broken poles, its contents scattered across the damp earth, along with 2 dead and battered goblins inside. The other tents were also silent, their flaps hung open. He scanned the area around the sputtering campfire and the base of the makeshift watchtower, but there was no movement, no chittering, no sound of hurried escape. The bodies of the goblins lay still and broken on the ground, their crude weapons scattered. The musky scent of their kind was heavy in the air, but the only living presence was his own, and the one tied to the tree. He retrieved Kenny's body once more. The weight of him felt familiar now, a cold anchor in the oppressive darkness of the forest. Its hide was stiff and cold beneath his fingers as he checked the rough vine noose. It remained securely fastened around Kenny's neck, a grim testament of the barbarian's earlier actions. The forest was silent around him, save for the murmur of the nearby river and the soft rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The flickering torchlight of the goblin camp casted long, dancing shadows, highlighting the stark scene of the barbarian's victory and the twisted trophy he carried. A cold wind blew and sent a chill that overtook the barbarian. He turned his attention to the central campfire. The flames that once flickered brightly were now barely embers, struggling against the damp night air. A thin wisp of smoke rose lazily into the darkness, carrying the faint scent of ash and damp wood. Without fresh fuel, it was destined to die out completely very soon. It offered little in the way of warmth or light against the encroaching chill of the forest night. The nearby river continued its constant rush, a steady, cold counterpoint to the fading warmth of the fire. The barbarian moved away from the ravaged camp and into the surrounding woods. His eyes scanned the shadowed undergrowth and the bases of ancient trees. After around half an hour of searching, he returned to the camp, empty-handed. He looked at the goblin tied to the tree and found it was still there. Without saying a word, he turned his search towards the remains of the camp. He meticulously sifted through the scattered contents of the ruined goblin tents and the debris around the campfire. The crude shelters yielded little materials for burnable fuel, beyond a few scraps of tattered cloth and gnawed bones. However, as he dug through a pile of what appeared to be goblin bedding, his fingers brushed against something small and hard. He pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden idol, depicting a fanged, snarling face. It felt cool and smooth to the touch, despite its rough appearance. Elsewhere, he found a few more loose silver coins, stuffing them into his pocket. Nothing else of value was found. The camp now was fully plundered. Its meager secrets were laid bare. The barbarian brought the wooden idol to his hands, and without a moment's hesitation, he flicked his wrist, sending the small, fanged carving in an arc through the air and into the heart of the campfire. For a moment, it resisted the flames. Then a faint hiss escaped as the dry wood caught. The snarling face warped and blackened, consumed quickly by the hungry orange glow. Soon, only a small pile of ash remained, which was indistinguishable from the rest of the burning fuel, and the last vestige of the strange totem vanished. The barbarian looked at the goblin tied to the tree, who was watching his every move. Its face held a wild look of fury and anger directed at the barbarian. Suddenly, the barbarian was sure the wooden idol he tossed into the dying flames belonged to the handless goblin. The barbarian shrugged his shoulders in indifference, because he realized the goblin would not be able to hold it anyway, or anything else, for that matter. Around the camp and the riverbank, while he managed to gather a small pile of branches and deadwood, it was enough to keep the fire burning for an hour. However, there were still several hours of darkness ahead, and the forest floor yielded no greater bounty. The dampness permeated much of the wood, and the truly dry, easily ignitable pieces were scarce. The replenished fire crackled warmly for now, but he suspected he will need to venture out again before the night is through, or risk letting the flames die out completely, leaving him exposed in the oppressive darkness. The chill of the night began to bite deeper. It carried the scent of damp earth and distant, unknown things. He felt the danger of the elements closing in as he turned his delirious attention to Kenny's well-being. The barbarian gently picked up Kenny's lifeless form, the crude map on his back a stark reminder of the night's grim events. He carefully carried him to one of the less damaged goblin tents. The torn hide offered little protection from the cold, but he thought it was better than nothing. Gently, he laid its body down upon the packed earth inside. He arranged the tattered scraps of goblin bedding around Kenny as he tucked him in for a rest. The vine noose still hung around his neck. The act, born of a strange blend of barbarian pragmatism and morbid ritual, felt complete in his mind. The barbarian stepped out of Kenny's tent, and the camp was now still, save for the crackling fire and the distant murmur of the river. He looked at the handless goblin, and he saw a look of abhorrent confusion. The barbarian just smiled, and once again focused on the task of fuel for the fire. With a grim resolve, the barbarian gave himself a solution to the task he felt must be done for the sake of survival. He turned his attention to the bodies of the goblins he had defeated earlier. With no hesitation, he swung the great axe down on a corpse. He repeated the process of separating limbs from torsos, the wet thud of the blade against bone echoing in the quiet clearing. He worked with a practiced efficiency, and he treated the grisly remains with a psychological detachment. Once dismembered, he hauled the parts to a spot near the fire and arranged them in stacks and piles. They resembled grotesque, haphazard logs, ready to be consumed by the flames. The barbarian heard the sound of a retch, followed by fluid splashing on the ground. He turned and saw the handless goblin looking down at the ground, with vomit dripping down its chest and legs. The barbarian laughed and finished the bloody work. He sat down by the fire and selected a severed arm from the pile. Its skin was leathery and gray in the firelight. With a heave, he tossed it to the flames. It landed with a wet sizzle, and for a moment, the fire flared violently, spitting sparks and smoke. The unmistakable acrid smell of burning flesh filled the air, overpowering the scent of pine and damp earth. The limb contorted and blackened rapidly, consumed by the heat. The fire, now fed with this grim fuel, roared a little brighter, which had cast an unsettling, flickering light across the macabre scene the barbarian had created. Throughout the long, dark hours, he continued his grim vigil. Each time the flames began to dwindle, he methodically added another goblin limb to the fire. The sickening sizzle and the stench of burning flesh became a constant, unsettling presence in the night air. It mingled with the sounds of the rushing river and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The fire, fueled by these macabre offerings, roared and crackled, which cast a flickering, unsteady light over the silent, dismembered camp and the tent where Kenny rested. By dawn, only ashes and scorched bones remained of the goblin horde, but the warmth of the fire had held the chill of the forest at bay, and the long night was finally broken by the first faint rays of light filtering through the canopy. He approached the tent where he had laid Kenny to rest. The barbarian gently shook the lifeless goblin's shoulder, and there was, of course, no response. His beady eyes remained fixed and unblinking, and his carved skin offered no reaction to his touch. The vine noose was still tight around its neck, and it remained as it had been since his first encounter. A silent, unmoving presence. A dark, unrequited covenant to the path the barbarian walked. He reached into the tent and grasped the vine noose. With a practiced tug, he pulled his light form from the tattered shelter. The sun was higher in the sky and began to filter more brightly through the trees, which illuminated the disturbing scene of the dismembered goblin perimeter. The grisly sight did nothing to the barbarian. His focus was set on the handless goblin, still tied to the tree. He dragged Kenny behind him, and the sound of its body bumping softly against the forest floor stirred the handless goblin from its uneasy slumber. The barbarian wore a grin as he cut the rope with his axe. The goblin looked at Kenny, then to the barbarian, unsure what to do with its new freedom. The barbarian simply smiled and pointed towards the sound of the river with his axe. "Run!" he ordered. The goblin was mortified with its mouth agape and followed the first command of its new master. It ran as fast as it could towards the sound of rushing water, and soon it found itself alone in the forest. It could not see the river yet, but the sounds of rushing water were getting closer. The handless goblin pressed on, and it heard very fast, booming footsteps coming from behind. It was the barbarian in a full sprint, and the handless goblin now realized it was being hunted for sport. It ran faster now, rushed with fearful adrenaline, and as it looked back, it saw the barbarian running right at it, with Kenny flying violently behind him, smacking on roots and trees as he pursued his game. It scrambled forward, and the sound of rushing water filled its ears, growing louder with every step. The trees began to thin slightly and revealed glimpses of glittering water through the leaves. The handless goblin finally met the river and almost fell in. It waved its handless arms comically as it tried to keep its balance. It looked right, then left. Then it noticed it had soiled itself again. However, this time, it was not urine. The handless goblin began to cry as it felt the slow drip of its excrement run down its little legs. Ignoring its predicament and realizing its time was running short, it decided to go left, with the river on its right, and continued its perilous flight. After several minutes, the handless goblin had thought it had gotten away and slowed to a stop near a bush on the riverbank to catch its breath. As soon as it stopped, the barbarian lunged from the brambles and tackled the goblin. There was a sickening crack of bone on impact with the hard ground. The goblin tried to scream. However, its voice was still lost, and what came out was more of a squeak. The handless goblin had broken its arm. The barbarian had heard the sound of a broken bone, but he did not know which. He did not care because his mind was focused on his hunt. He wrestled the goblin into submission, even though the handless goblin offered no resistance. The barbarian had gotten the handless goblin in a rear chokehold and began to shout, "Tap out!" repeatedly, full well knowing the goblin had no hands to tap out with. The handless goblin had tried to slap his stubs gently against the barbarian's leg to signal its surrender, but either the barbarian did not consider this a tap-out, or he did not care. Eventually, it slipped into unconsciousness. Upon realizing this, the barbarian released the choke and looked at the handless goblin. He saw its right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle at the bicep, and further examination told the barbarian it had shit itself. Then he noticed the dark blood flowing from its stubs. The wounds had reopened during the takedown. The barbarian spurred into action to stop the blood loss in order to save his plaything. He tore off the handless goblin's soiled trousers, the last of its worldly possessions, and ripped them into tattered rags. The barbarian did not even consider the foul bacteria these soiled bandages would introduce to the handless goblin's immune system. He wrapped each of the unconscious goblin stubs tight with the now tattered, soiled remains of its trousers. Save for the bandages, the handless goblin was now totally exposed. The barbarian stood up upon completion of the first aid and looked down the river towards the direction the handless goblin was going. He looked down at Kenny, who was certainly worse for wear, with splinters and dirt covering most of his body. He was also missing a tooth the barbarian swore he had seen there earlier. I had a river joke, but I cannot remember it. Oh well, it is water under the bridge now, the barbarian muttered, and a faint, unsettling chuckle escaped his lips. He paused and expected a reply, but the attempt at humor was heard only by the forest, a strange counterpoint to the roar of the river. The barbarian examined Kenny's noose and began to tie the end he'd been holding to the handless goblin's ankles. He tied the knot tight, cutting off blood circulation to its feet. The barbarian did not want to carry the unconscious handless goblin, and thought this was the best solution to his problem. Once he was satisfied with the knot, he grabbed the vine noose around the center and began to drag Kenny and the handless one along the riverbank. After some time of walking, he decided to have a thought-provoking conversation with Kenny. "I have cities but no houses, forests but no trees, and water but no fish. What am I, Kenny?" the barbarian said with a smile. He waited for a moment, and the only answer was the handless one's labored breathing and the rhythmic scraping of their bodies against the forest floor, with the rushing sound of the river running its course. "A map, Kenny, just like the one I carved on your back," he answered. A faint, dry smile touched his lips. He continued his journey and kept his eyes on the river, searching for a way across as he dragged his green companions behind him. After a time, the barbarian's stomach grumbled, and it had just occurred to him that he had not eaten for as long as he could remember. He scanned the riverbank and searched for a suitable branch and something to serve as a line and hook. His fingers fumbled with a particularly thorny bush as he tried to snap off a thin, sturdy twig for a hook. With a sudden, clumsy jerk, the branch snapped, which sent a cluster of sharp thorns directly into the back of the barbarian's hand. He let out a grunt of pain as he pulled back his hand to see several small, painful punctures bleeding sluggishly. He heard a dry cackle from behind him, and he saw the handless goblin watching him with amusement. The barbarian simply smiled and walked over to the naked, handless goblin and put his boot to its throat to keep it pinned down. He then unzipped his trousers and let a torrential stream of urine fall upon the goblin's face. The handless goblin spat and coughed and sputtered. It brought its stubs to its face in a futile attempt to block the downpour. After about a minute and a half, the barbarian finished and zipped up his trousers. The handless goblin laughed no more, and he turned to refocus on his task. Not only had he failed to find any suitable materials, but his hand now ached, which made even simple movements uncomfortable. The river continued to rush by, indifferent to the barbarian's predicament. The throbbing in his hand seemed to worsen as he grit his teeth and reached for more materials. He noticed an aggressive numbing feeling in his hand where he had been poked. The barbarian had suddenly wondered if the thorns held a type of anesthetic poison. He tried to ignore the stark deadening in his hand as he attempted to snap a thin branch, hoping for a better shape this time. However, his numbed hand's grip was weak and unsteady. The wood slipped from his grasp and tumbled into the river with a soft plop, carried away with the current. He tried again with another piece, but the same result occurred. It either broke or skittered away from his numb fingers. The river continued to flow. Its water was clear and enticing, but without the means to fish, it remained an inaccessible bounty. Kenny's silent, unmoving form lay nearby and offered no assistance, a stark contrast to the futile efforts the barbarian had made. "I'm fucking trying, Kenny!" the barbarian shouted. The outburst ripped through the quiet of the forest, the words raw and tinged with anger. The handless goblin flinched at the barbarian's words as he glared down at Kenny's unmoving form, his carved back stark in the dim light. The river continued its ceaseless, indifferent rush beside him, and the oppressive silence of the woods seemed to swallow his outburst. His injured hand throbbed, and he felt the numbing sensation turn to a searing heat, a physical manifestation of his mounting frustration. The task of crafting a fishing pole and hook remained as impossible as ever, and Kenny, his silent companion, offered no solace or assistance, only a vacant stare. The handless goblin was mortified as it witnessed this single-sided exchange. It wondered why the barbarian spoke to its dead, and why he hauled the corpse around with him everywhere he went, and why he called him Kenny. The maimed goblin did not know. What the handless goblin did know, however, was the fact that it did not feel well. It felt hot, and its sweat made it cold, early symptoms of a fever. The goblin looked at the filthy bandages made from its soiled trousers, wrapped around its still bleeding stubs. It noticed its veins had turned black and were spreading up its arms from the amputated wound. Its small body was fighting a deadly infection. It looked at the barbarian with a wild look of hate and swore to itself it would kill him. Its train of thought was broken when it saw the barbarian grab his axe. The barbarian paid no mind to the handless goblin. His angered focus was set on Kenny when he retrieved his great axe and slowly walked to him and took a knee. He was careful, yet with brutal precision, he began to add to the crude map etched into Kenny's hide. He traced new lines, which represented the winding river and the rough outline of the goblin camp he obliterated. He even marked the location of the dismembered goblins. The axe's edge scraped against the stiff hide, deepened the existing marks, and added new, jagged contours to the morbid atlas. The work was slow and deliberate, a silent chronicle of his journey carved into his deceased companion. The barbarian found he did this more so out of anger from the lack of progress to find food, rather than a practical, albeit gruesome way to track his odyssey. He looked at the handless goblin, and it was covering its eyes with its stubs, cowering in horror. It saw enough, and it wanted to see no more. The barbarian laughed, and for a moment he had forgotten about the pain in his hand. The handless goblin unshielded its eyes and started speaking its chittering tongue. It was begging the barbarian to kill it, to put it out of its miserable existence. The barbarian did not understand. He put his hands up in a mocking gesture of sarcastic exasperation and started mimicking the goblin's speech. To the handless goblin, it was gibberish. To the barbarian, it was humor. The barbarian turned away from the handless goblin's chittering pleas, dismissing the small creature. He had already set his mind to try again, his injured hand throbbing with each movement. He spotted a relatively straight, thin branch that might serve as a pole, but as he reached for it, the sharp pain from his hand flared, causing his grip to falter. The branch slipped from his grasp and tumbled down the muddy bank and into the swift current of the river, carried away instantly. The barbarian shouted, a primal roar that seemed to shake the trees and cause the birds to take flight. The barbarian had lost his mind. He stormed up to the handless goblin and ordered it to make fire. The goblin did not understand, even when the barbarian shouted the same command repeatedly half a dozen times in rapid succession. It shrunk down in fear and thought it was over when he raised his massive battle axe. The goblin closed its black beady eyes and prepared itself for the next life, if there was one. The next moment, the handless goblin felt a sharp cut, followed by a dull pain on the toes of its right foot. Its eyes flew open with shock and pain. The barbarian had aimed for the vine rope that he had bound to the goblin's ankles earlier, only he had not just succeeded in his goal. He had also chopped off 3 of the armless goblin's toes. He immediately dropped his axe and put his hands up in an apologetic gesture as he profusely apologized. The handless goblin had thought nothing would surprise it anymore. This, however, was new. It kicked and howled as it shook off the vine rope and began to cry in the fetal position, and a small pool of fluid had formed around its waist on the earth. The handless goblin had urinated all over itself. Again. The barbarian was still apologizing, and this time the armless goblin understood it was an accident. but it just wanted to die. Eventually, the barbarian stopped talking and put his hands on his hips for a few moments and stared at the handless goblin and felt disgust for the pathetic creature. The goblin heard the same command the barbarian had given him before he had cut its toes off. His words felt as if it had cut like a dagger. The handless goblin slowly sat up and brought its gaze to the barbarian, and very sadly looked at its stubs, the debilitating handicap the barbarian himself had wrought upon it. The barbarian did not care. He retrieved a short stick and a piece of tree bark from the ground to use as a hand drill kit. He composed a brief demonstration in front of the handless goblin, ignoring the slight discomfort in his hand the thorns had caused. The barbarian had gotten the drill to produce a thin wisp of smoke before he stopped and looked at the handless goblin expectantly. Once more, the handless goblin presented its infected stubs to the barbarian. Again, he did not care. He tossed the hand drill kit to the goblin, full well knowing it could not catch. The result was a haphazard juggle of the bark and stick as the handless goblin fumbled with its stubs. Both found their way to the ground. This made the barbarian roar with laughter, while the handless goblin looked at the ground and wondered how it was to pick up the stick and bark. It looked at the barbarian helplessly, but he just stood there with his arms crossed and waited patiently for the armless goblin to pick up the hand drill kit and get to work. The handless goblin coughed and ignored its fever as it slowly got down on knees and stubs. It ignored the pain of all its injuries, and its broken arm could not help bear the weight of its small body in this position. Therefore, the handless goblin favored its left stub for full support. This resulted in a complete failure of the handless goblin's body as it collapsed to the ground. The barbarian shook his head in disappointment. The handless goblin used his teeth to pick up the stick. Slowly, it sat up and used its stubs to place the bark. Then, it used its feet to hold it there. Once the bark was secured, the handless goblin carefully held the stick, pressing it between its forearms, tolerating the pain of its broken arm with great effort, before finally letting go with its teeth. The barbarian watched with great interest as the handless goblin began to rub its arms together, with a stick in between, and the end of it on the bark. The handless goblin was sweating profusely and had coughing bouts as it manned the hand drill. Slowly, and after quite some time, smoke started to rise from the tree bark of the hand drill. The handless goblin was very careful to not let any of the blood from its bleeding foot flow onto the point of friction. Eventually, a small flame appeared on the bark, and just as the goblin was about to gently blow on it, the barbarian violently pushed the handless goblin aside, and it nearly fell into the river. The barbarian looked at the flame with a prehistoric awe as he added the kindling. With a fire started, he simply held up a stick and told it to get more. The handless goblin looked at its stubs again, coughed, and reluctantly obeyed. As the barbarian tended to the fire, the handless goblin had tried using its remaining toes, its mouth, and its stubs in all combinations, only to find the most efficient way to deliver the wood was to simply kick it a few feet at a time towards the fire. The issue quickly arose when it realized it could not keep its balance on its right foot, which was missing 3 toes. A sad realization had settled on the handless goblin. It had to kick with its bad and lean on its good. Arcs of pain flared in the goblin's maimed foot every time he kicked a log. It took several agonizing kicks to get the wood to its destination. On the 3rd or 4th trip back, the handless goblin kicked a rotten piece of wood towards the fire, ignoring the dull pain of its missing toes and the rising fever. Very suddenly, a snake had jumped out of the log and bit him on the leg. The handless goblin jumped in shock and felt a sharp pain just above the knee. It saw 2 bleeding dots where the snake had bit him. Pain was beginning to be an old friend to the handless goblin. After a lot of coughing, kicking, and quite some time, the barbarian was satisfied with a rather large pile of firewood the handless goblin had gathered. It sat down, coughing up phlegm and exhausted from the labor. The infection its body was fighting was winning. Its right foot had swollen and still bled from where its toes used to be. The nerves in its throat pinched every time it would cough or swallow, and it still wondered if it would ever speak again. The snakebite burned, and it felt the venom course through its veins. Its broken arm had felt numb and far, far away. Its stubs felt dull, yet any touch echoed extreme flares of excruciating pain that traveled to its throbbing head. The handless goblin, all in all, was not well. It looked at the barbarian wearily, and it saw an ominous resolve in his eyes.